Welcome back to Brave New Classics and our second season, Άλλοι, Antiquity and the Greek Left in the 20th Century. I'm Anna Coopey, and this week we'll be diving into the second of our character profiles, which, combined, will form a rich bank of examples of Greek leftist engagement with antiquity throughout the 20th century. This profile is of Karolos Koun, the theatre director most famous for his productions of Aristophanes, who brought the work of artists such as Bertolt Brecht to Greece, often for the first time. To talk about Koun, I spoke with Professor Gonda Van Steen, the Korais Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at King's College London, and the director of the Centre for Hellenic Studies. We met in Gonda's office in central London.
Could you give us a brief rundown of who Karolos Koun was?
Karolos Koun is probably the single most important Greek producer of theatre, ancient and modern, innovator, teacher. He really brought a vision to modern Greek theatre that was formative. He then also was the most forgotten character of modern Greek theatre. So whenever I speak with somebody who's kind of been interested in ancient drama in modern Greece, the name of Koun always comes up, Karolos Koun. And then the question is, where can I find a book devoted to Koun? And that book devoted to Koun has actually never been written. So there are kind of appreciations, there are coffee table books, picture books, but actually a deep analysis of all that Koun had to offer, his conceptions over time, his legacy, it has actually never really been tackled. And so to most people that's a mystery, because of course it also prevents other people from engaging more closely with Koun and developing a real appreciation of what he contributed to modern Greek theatre. And it's almost as if his personality and his contribution is a little too intimidating to tackle. I've thought about it and shrank away from it. So I can kind of see that, for longer he may just stay rather in obscurity, unfortunately. Very undeserved.
Absolutely. So he was a 20th century figure. What exactly were his dates?
He was born in 1908 and lived until 1987. That's a rather long age. He was also a very addicted smoker. He was of an interesting mixed descent, and a component of that was Jewish, because Koun is a formation of the word Kohen. Kohen, which in Greek very few people realize. They know that Koun doesn't immediately sound Greek, but that deduction is Jewish and a form of Kohen. That kind of startles them. And of course, Koun played into that in that he never really promoted his Jewishness in a great way or in a very visible way. To him, that didn't seem to be very important. He was not observant. If he would identify as anything, it would be as Greek, not as Jewish, half Jewish. He left that legacy behind. He had been a teacher of English in Robert College in Istanbul, where he also got part of his education. And then he was hired at prestigious Athens College in Greece, where he had kind of access to the cream of the crop of Greek society, right? You will already have noticed that anyone with any position in Greece comes from that circle that originates in Athens College, and they all know each other, and they're all connected to each other. And so he starts teaching there, and already in the early years, teaching English, he starts generating interest among the students to do drama. And he becomes not only the English teacher, but also the teacher who puts on drama performances. And so Aristophanes is one of his early choices to do with the students. And it's very interesting to see these 1930s productions with students become the breeding ground of what then develops in the 1950s and later on, sometimes with the very same people.
Very interesting. So, I mean, immediately 1930s screams out to me Metaxas. What kind of relationship did he have with the Metaxas regime? Was there any kind of active opposition or any kind of engagement with that?
With the Metaxas regime, we don't know of any particular friction. He was, of course, protected by the fact that his productions were only, inverted commas, student productions, and in this favorable environment of Athens College, where, if anything, people let it go as a student production, let's say. So there wasn't that kind of political voice that would develop later, and that would come to a height in 1959. For now, these were just productions being watched by parents and theatrophiles because it was a college production, and also because Koun was starting to create a certain name for himself. But he wasn't on the radar of any censors quite yet, because he hadn't really formed a professional theater group yet. That came in 1942 with the Teatro Technisch, the art theater. And then he did suffer from censorship under the German occupation, and again under the Greek military dictatorship. But those early and very formative years in the 1930s were kind of the stage where it seemed rather innocuous, let's say, what he was doing.
So when did he really start getting involved with leftist politics, if he did, in any way?
That's an interesting question, because he was never very outspoken about being anti-right. Of course, he's anti-occupation, but on the other hand, he's also able to work during the occupation. And the same with the military dictatorship. He is against the dictators, but he is still traveling abroad, for instance. So he is not the one to come out with manifestos or take a lead role in demonstrations or so, but he does house and accommodate and promote leftist artists. Varnal is being an example, Vasilis Rotas being an example. And so his affiliations are with lots of leftists. And he feels that rather than theorizing about what left and right should be doing, he feels he can contribute more by a practice of inclusivity, by bringing these sometimes marginalized authors and names to the stage and giving them a real role in a collective important work that in itself, for its innovative spirit, can be a platform of criticism, but without necessarily voicing the head-on criticism. And that head-on criticism is something that some people, especially younger people, very much expect. And other producers and playwrights give them that. Koun is explicit in other ways. He's explicit in artistic ways. And he makes his own kind of statements through his work or through the voices of an Aristophanes, for instance. In fact, when Koun came to produce in London under the dictatorship, there were people demonstrating outside, saying that because he was still producing, that it looked like he was supporting the dictatorship. And then he was also accepting American money through the Ford Foundation, and that looked like a sellout to the Americans who were condoning the regime. And again, he didn't take a very vocal stance against that. He focused on his work and felt that over the long duration, his work would speak for itself.
Yeah, so he seems to have been one of those many people in Greece who have suffered from the polemics of left and right, and trying to be forced into either camp. He's kind of existing in the middle.
He also positioned himself quite effectively, deliberately and non-deliberately, as an outsider. He was partly Jewish. He was very gay. He's a teacher by nature. He's kind of alone in his own world. And in every interview, his focus is on the artistic work. You don't hear him make big pronouncements about politics. He talks about the spirit of the people that he wants to honor and the culture that they have developed. And you could call that a very demotic leftist agenda, but he doesn't cast it in the kind of narrow political terms. I think he kind of quite cleverly kept on the outside of a society that he felt was probably too wrapped up in left and right-wing politics, to the extent that it may even have hampered people's creativity.
So we've already talked about polemics and the way in which the political divide in Greece was so stark. Straight away, we've got to jump into the occupation. So can we talk a bit more about what exactly he did during the occupation and his artistic role during that?
During the occupation, first of all, he felt that it was important to keep the theatre active and to keep his actors fed. F-E-D, fed, just plain fed. And that was already a big achievement because there was famine, there was starvation. He got his hands on certain small pockets of money, and people remember that he would just take them to a taverna to eat. While, after work, after doing extensive rehearsals and such, just as a way of not necessarily paying them proper wages, because what was money worth in those days, anything, such blatant inflation, but just to reward them by a proper meal. And then he used to engage in tricks like, for instance, you could stage works by certain Allied authors, and he would just change the name on the play.
Okay.
Kind of counting on the fact that the censor wouldn't be smart enough to figure it out. And so those were some of the things for which he really stuck his neck out. And being partly Jewish, this could have taken a very ugly turn. And yet he seemed to have gotten away with it repeatedly. He never speaks about being arrested or questioned. He seems to continue to work and bring on the occasional show and do that quite successfully. And he saw his task more as lifting morale at that time, which he did effectively. And that will probably become one of the main contributions, that he was always shaping an audience and lifting morale in the darkest times.
Definitely. So after the occupation, we have the Civil War, obviously, and all of the conflict that goes on in the late 40s. Was he involved in any of that?
He was not actively involved in the Civil War. He certainly never went to the mountains or so, but he does harbor and gives a role to people who have a very left-wing reputation. And that would be enough for some people to kind of see red flags, right? The fact that Vasilis Rotas, in the 1959 production of The Birds, made anti-American statements by way of the translation of The Birds of Aristophanes, and that Koun knew that was going to be like waving a red flag in front of a bull. That's kind of typical Koun. He let it happen. It didn't offend him. He's quite okay with it going forward. But then also the production got curtailed, got stopped. And then he vocally complains that this is unheard of, this is censorship, this is unfair. So there are certain areas in which he has to speak out, but it's always immediately related to play production, not to politicians so and so.
I mean, we've already gone into it a little bit, but his fantastic production of Birds and Aristophanes that you've already written about so brilliantly in Venom in Verse,
Thank you.
Which I was reading just this morning. Could you tell us a bit more about that production and maybe a little bit specifically about the importance of Aristophanes to the Greek left?
Right. First of all, we come from a long tradition where ancient drama was interesting. People felt it should be part of the modern Greek identity. They also felt that drama should be very well respected. You couldn't translate it in demotiki. You had to kind of keep an elevated language. Translations in Katarevusa in the first stage, if you could even translate at all, because that too was a debate. So this debate plays out all through the 19th century and well into the beginning of the 20th century, with some pretty violent episodes associated with it. But Aristophanes went under the radar because he was Aristophanes, because comedy wasn't taken as seriously, and because comedy is already so much more virtuoso in its language, and Aristophanes in particular. And so it was as if staging Aristophanes got you poetic license to bring scatological humor and other humor onto the stage, even political humor. And then even the vernacular, because after all, you're showing very demotic characters, right? And so it's in that spirit that Koun really wanted to do The Birds. Back in the day, he called it Greek folk expressionism, as a way of calling Aristophanes an instant conduit to the simple man of antiquity, not to as philosophical as in Euripides, but as a sense of like, the common man now and the common man back then have a connection, and that telegraph between the two is clearly Aristophanes in the way that the tragedians don't provide that. And so that it would do justice, therefore, to Aristophanes to give him that demotic character. And so then the birds come on, and then Aristophanes at some point brings on a priest, and for Koun that becomes the Greek Orthodox priest who does some sort of a mock prayer, which then the censors find hugely insulting of the Orthodox religion. which it doesn't have to be, of course, because the Greeks always have a kind of serious, non-serious relationship with the church. It's not as if they're bawling over with respect for the church all the time. But for some people, this went too far, especially on stage and especially under conservative government. But it seemed that the greater offense was really the translation by an outspoken leftist, Vasilis Rotas. And so the whole package was just too much. And the production was immediately stopped. And Koun, of course, when a production is stopped, you lose money over it, right? You have invested so much. And so, in 1959, the production couldn't go through. Koun spoke to the newspapers with a certain amount of resentment. He felt that was very unfair, but he didn't stop there. And then he did revise the production a little bit and then took it abroad, where it became hugely successful. And sometimes that works, taking the laurels abroad first before they bring the production back to Greece. And so it was after the fall of the dictatorship then that very symbolically Aristophanes' birds could reappear as those historic birds. Because as much as Aristophanes should be about constant innovation and synchronizing and adjusting to modern circumstances, this particular production, for being so modernized, has then actually become a classic in its own right. And now there's a sense that you can't touch Koun's birds anymore because everybody wants to see the historic bird in the same way that they caused an outcry back then. So this production has gone from taking huge liberties to become very classical, whereas the normal trend, even in tragedy, has been very respectful of the text to finally make the text more current, more relevant to modern times. So that production of the bird really goes against the grain. And it has had another effect too, in that very few producers after Koun have actually dared to tackle the birds. Because he has put such a heavy stamp on it that you cannot avoid comparison with Koun's birds.
So he's almost like a new Aristophanes.
Exactly. The 1959 production becomes a classic in its own right.
Okay. So you already touched on the colonels and the military junta. What was going on with Koun during that?
He was never given one of the prominent stages. And by then it's clear what the prominent stages are. They are the stages of the Athens and the Epidaurus festival. That means the Herodes Atticus Theatre and the Theatre in Epidaurus. The Theatre in Epidaurus being even more prestigious than the Herodes Atticus Theatre. And clearly those were the stages now exclusively reserved for groups that worked with the regime and for the National Theatre. And that National Theatre has the reputation of always being, more conservative. Or at least people know who the characters are who rise to directorships and such. So a bit more controlled, even if you don't control the actual production. The controlling of appointments is already prominent enough to kind of know, who's in charge and what they're going to bring, to know who you're dealing with. And so that was Koun was excluded from all of that. That also meant he had to financially survive on his own, whereas official theatre groups would get state subsidies. And that financial survival was always very hard for Koun. He was never a very managerial mind, and he has no idea of numbers. And so I've written an article about his dealings with the Ford Foundation, and they favored him. And yes, they are an American institution that drew a lot of criticism in Greece, but they sponsored quite a lot of left-wing dissident kind of activity. And so Koun accepted the money, but very much on his own terms. And then he was actually never very public about accepting the money because he knew that it had a bit of a bad reputation, as if you sold out to the Americans who condoned the dictatorship. So Koun is kind of blurry on the fact of how much he received, how many grants. He always makes it seem as if it's an infusion at the right time when things were critical, otherwise there wouldn't have been a theatre, which may well be true. But over the course of several years, Koun accepts a pretty handsome amount of money, and it's actually 2 different grants. And he's supposed to do proper accounts and proper justifications and proper grant applications, and he doesn't care for any of that.
Right.
And so what he does, he sends personal letters to the director of the Ford Foundation with well wishes for his wife and family and, reminiscing about the last time they met. And by the way, we're working on this and I've discovered a few new playwrights and if you could just continue to sponsor it. And on the inside, the Ford Foundation people are pulling their hair out that they can't bring him to proper reporting and proper accounting. So he's supposed to justify every expense made on Ford Foundation money, and he sends his long slews of numbers, like the way these old calculator machines would spit out.
Yeah.
Without, yes, you see every category of numbers, but it doesn't say what they're connected to. And he sends these rings and rings of numbers, and they just kind of their hands up and say, we have to take it as is. He's doing good work. So be it. So to Koun's credit, I actually think he didn't have a very managerial mind. You could read more in that and said he did it deliberately as a way of accepting money on his own terms. I think there's part of that too, but I think the stronger factor is he really didn't want to spend time on that. He had other things to do.
Yeah.
He is, on the model of the ancient playwrights, producer, accounts manager, public relations figure, artistic director, choreographer. He's doing everything, right? He is very demanding on himself, relentless, but he's also equally demanding on his people. And I've met people who actually dropped out of his drama school, and they said it was very hard because he has no sense of hours, he has no sense of breaks. No, actors would be unionized. You need to be kept to certain hours and certain working conditions. He didn't care for any of that.
Wow.
No, he just felt that it's a calling and I'm being called and I ask a lot of myself and I ask the same of you. So a whole lot of people actually couldn't take it. It was too suffocating, too absorbing. And what also wasn't nice, he did play favorites. So they felt that, yes, they were getting an education, but no, they would never rise to the top if they weren't one of the favorites. And those favorites were very often men that he had a crush on. So the women felt quite disadvantaged. And the woman I met spoke with a certain amount of bitterness about that experience of always being kept as a reserve, let's say. And whether you were good or not, that it ultimately made very little difference because the favorites who weren't as good were already anointed for the lead roles. And so they speak about that with a certain resentment. And she says at some point she just had to quit. She couldn't do it anymore. So he was a pretty idiosyncratic teacher. And sure enough, when it was time for the succession was handled by two of his favorites who had already been given the lead roles for many years. There's a third character, Anna Coopey is her name, who does get the occasional lead female role. But you kind of get the sense that's because one needs a lead female role at some point, right? There's quite a certain kind of sense of bitterness around how, especially the final years were handled, when he certainly didn't choose the strongest, but he chose the one he favored most.
Yeah, interesting. So you've talked a lot about female roles and female characters. Are there any particular female-centric plays that he deals with? Like, for example, does he look at Aristophanes' Lysistrata at any point or engage with that at all?
He does engage with the women's plays. Rena Pitaki is usually the one who rises to the top, but I'm not sure of which years exactly she covers. But you have to realize that, for instance, Yorgos Lazanis, who was his ultimate favorite, these people last for 30 or 40 years. So that leads me back to the question that some people felt they got a training, but very few openings to break through and come onto the stage.
So we've talked a little bit about Aristophanes, obviously, in the 1959 production. What kind of relationship did he have with Antiquity generally? Did he make any comments about it?
He feels that the Greeks have special access to the ancient plays through some sort of a sense of descendancy, let's say, through a real sense of descent. And if that descent is not exactly a matter of DNA, a word he wouldn't have used, it's a different kind of affinity, even for being in the same place, in the same geographical and climate conditions. He feels that kind of generates a closeness that other people, especially Northerners, cannot ever achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So he feels that the Greeks have a privileged position. And he's not the only one to think that.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of occasionally find out a very chauvinist argument, as if there's a kind of a special channel of communication with the ancients. Why he played into that rhetoric, I do not know. But it went over pretty well in Greece. And I find it a bit contrived at times, because that doesn't necessarily vouch for renovation or true innovation with the vision. Sometimes it vouches only for a certain kind of replicating of what is acceptable, for an affirmation of the status quo rather than a shaking up of the status quo.
So during the period in which Koun is engaging with Antiquity, we've obviously got a lot of official Antiquity coming through government channels and nationalist channels. And obviously the question of nationalism and the left is quite difficult to deal with in Greece. But I'm wondering if in any sense you think he might be responding to right-wing uses of Antiquity.
Yes. Yeah, a good example is his Persians, which comes out right before the dictatorship in 1966 and is quite a breakthrough production. And now you could read the Persians in the kind of right-wing nationalist way as rah, 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 we Greeks won twice over the Persians. But he reads it more as an ominous prediction of that dictatorship, which will ultimately collapse under the weight of its own incompetence, much like Xerxes himself. And so he sees it more as Greeks, Persians, that kind of overbearing hubris, that belief in military might, and that arrogance with which some leaders lead soldiers to the slaughter, essentially, that can't do any good. And whether it happens on the Greek side or on the Persian side, on the Greek side being the Greek dictatorship that will soon come into play, the warning is don't do it. It is too risky. It is too undemocratic. It's ultimately about huge loss. And the play, The Persians, is indeed about loss, with sympathy for loss on the other side. What is so remarkable in that play is that he assigns a much more prominent role than usual to the chorus of elders, of Persian elders, who need to comfort the Queen Atossa, who has misgivings that something bad may be happening in Greece while her son Xerxes is there. And so these chorus members then, much like in the Birds, that's an element that he's developed in comedy and then transferred to tragedy. The chorus really becomes that kind of vibrant, vivid element in an ancient production that stands out, that, where a mass of people gains a certain individuality, kind of a channel for speaking for greater groups. And you see that in the 1960s, when he brings the production, that's not always the case. In fact, very often the opposite is the case. That you see producers who do not know what to do with the chorus and make it a very unwieldy element and a bit of a burden on the rest of the play. And so Koun inverts that image completely and very successfully so. Add to that these Persian elders are absolutely gorgeously dressed and there's the sweeping music to go with it. And instead of like still formations on stage, they whirl and express their panic by almost like whirling dervishes on the stage. It's really quite impressive. There are video clips of it on YouTube, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay, we'll have to put some links to that in the description. So, thinking about the prominence that he gives the chorus then, in my own research, I've discovered that a lot of left-wing responses to ancient tragedy really do fasten onto that chorus and really do expand the role. I mean, one thing that's coming to mind is Yanis Ritsos in one of the poems that I work on. I think he gives a huge role to the chorus. I'm wondering if in any way Koun had any, or if you know of any engagement with other leftist, or maybe we'll say fellow traveller, theatrical professionals or adapters in Europe or in America.
It's interesting that you should ask, because Koun is really mainly the one responsible for bringing Brecht to the Greek theatre. And Brecht, of course, especially after he died, is already identified as a left-wing anti-fascist voice. And Brechtian theatre in Latin America under dictatorships is hugely popular. And so Koun is the one who brings that kind of resistance theatre, that Brechtian, that criticizing theatre, that Brechtian theatre provides, who brings that to the stage and who makes a breakthrough for Brecht in Greece, who then becomes very popular. And everybody starts doing Brecht under the dictatorship. And because the Brechtian techniques, you kind of, your traditional theater escapes you. You have people doing the action and criticizing the action and kind of inverting the action, dissecting the action. And so Brechtian theater, as such a novel mode as it was, also has an easier way escaping the scrutiny of the censor because it is a much more intangible product. And it is Koun who introduces Greece to Brecht and Koun who actually shapes an audience for a Brechtian appetite.
Okay, so you mentioned a performance of Aeschylus and the Persians. Are there any other tragedies that he deals with?
Yes, he did other tragedies as well. But what I found, I don't want to be the one constantly referring back to ancient tragedy. Some people will actually consider his work on the ancients less important, again, than his contribution to Brechtian theater, but also his discovery of new playwrights, including female playwrights, of which we have very few. Very few. So the fact that in an era when ancient theater, ancient drama seemed to hold all the prestige, that he dares to bring new playwrights nobody has heard of to the stage and really give them the resources that he has available, that is probably the even bigger contribution. Playwrights who were then young and under the gun, and he took a huge risk on. And they include, for instance, Lula Anagnostaki and her kind of claustrophobic psychologizing theater that really captures the atmosphere of the dictatorship really well. He also brings absurdist theater to the stage, and he's quite keen on French absurdist theater. Ionesco, for instance. He has his eye out on, he notices Pirandello, he notices Genet. So he is watching theater literally from ancient to modern. He's also interested in American psychological drama, in poetic realism. So it's amazing just how broad his range is and how he's not afraid of experimenting with that. And on the side then, because he does these productions quite well and in very innovative ways, he's really giving an entire younger generation in Greece a drama education.
Yeah.
Because people go to the play by Koun, not because it's Ionesco, but they figure that if Koun is interested enough in Ionesco, then this Ionesco must be worth looking at. And so let's go and check it out. And so there are numerous people who've told me that they would go to a play just because it's by Koun, not because who's being played. And I found that I've never heard that about anyone else. Whatever he does, it must be interesting enough to go and watch. And then we learn about what these playwrights are all about. We would call them groupies.
Yeah.
But it's really not meant to be the rah fans. It's really meant to kind of say, especially when the Hulda controls what books you read and what can be translated, that this is a kind of adult education form of a different nature, knowing that Koun will bring quality. And that a discovery by Koun is worth a discovery by us. And so when it comes to kind of prioritizing what ultimately is most important in what he did, I would definitely mark that. That until then, until Koun, young and upcoming playwrights have never had a proper chance. And a female playwright has never had a proper chance. Some actually say that, the Greeks will play foreign debutant playwrights before they play a Greek playwright. So Koun is really the one to actually say, we don't need to look across the border for other kind of forms of theater. We have good stuff coming from Greece itself. Yorgos Skourtis is a good example, for instance, who made his debut under Koun. And then every one of them who stayed with theater really kind of branched out on his own, her own, because Koun gave them a chance. He really let a whole generation of actors, musicians, costume designers, set designers, choreographers gain their wings.
I'm wondering if you think it's anything to do with his kind of outsider position.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way that he's kind of looking on the world from this really oblique standpoint.
Yeah. He doesn't feel he has to follow the status quo and go with known values necessarily. Yeah.
Do you think that perhaps relates to his patronage of leftist translators?
Yeah, you could say the same, because he realizes that these younger people otherwise never get a chance.
Yeah. Okay, so you've mentioned how he brought a lot of female playwrights to the fore.
Yeah, not a lot.
A few.
Yeah.
And that's something that I have been struggling to find in my research for this podcast, of just finding examples of, particularly leftist, because that is the nature of the podcast, leftist Greek artists who have engaged with the ancient world in a way that people have fruitfully engaged with in scholarship and drawn attention to. And I'm wondering if there's anyone that you think needs to be talked about more.
The one I would single out is Marietta Rialdi.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely fascinating figure. And I had an interview with her, and now she has died. And I really treasure the way we talked. So Marietta Rialdi was a young woman, very left-wing, very unconventional. And she did everything. Playwriting, stage directing, translating, communications, publicity, you name it. Mm. She was the single most censored author, playwright, producer, all in one under the dictatorship. The single most muzzled producer. She does productions both of her own work, and she writes quite effectively. And then she also brings in plays like Handke, and she translates the play as Vrison Dastokino, cursing the audience, basically. Scolding the audience is the play. And so I said, what does that even mean? And she said, we sat there, and for an hour and a half, we scolded the audience. And I'm like, okay, wow, that must be something. Scolding the audience.
Amazing.
And very often she got away with like one production of a play, and then it would be shut down. And I said, Marietta, but how does that work financially? And she said, we didn't care. We didn't care. We just felt we had to do it. Yeah, there comes a moment, and here's where, again, I've seen a few ugly sides of Koun that sometimes also get forgotten, and they need to be said. Koun had a weird relationship with female talent. He was an admirer of Lula Anagnostaki and promoted her, because that suited his agenda of a certain kind of claustrophobia that he discovered in theater, which was also duplicated in the physical form of his theater, which was in a basement underground, a big cinema. And so the play really fits there. But Anagnostaki is not very feminist. So I was looking for something more, but for Koun that seems to be enough. Whereas Marietta Rialdi is feminist, young, rebellious, provocative, all of it. And so at some point, the Ford Foundation is considering basically extending an award to Marietta Rialdi. So they're watching the scene, and Marietta Rialdi's name comes up, and they make the big mistake of asking Koun what he thinks of her. And Koun says, she does interesting work, but I don't think it's actually that worthwhile. And in the same line, he says, I've got this from hearsay, I've actually never seen any of her plays. And that I found so damaging, so unfair. You've never seen any of the plays. But I kind of wonder if he didn't want to see the attention divided, to see the funds divided. He pretty much stopped Marietta Rialdi's options right there. And I find that very unprofessional and very ungenerous. But I also find it very unwise of the Ford Foundation people then to ask Koun. You don't ask the competitor.
Yeah.
Koun was quite happy having a kind of a monopoly on innovative, rebellious theater with young playwrights and all. So you don't ask then what he thinks of the competitor. That's bound to go wrong as a question. So why they would not only ask him, but then also let his answer influence their decision, and Marietta Rialdi never got anything, that is rather shocking to me.
But she's definitely someone who seems to deserve a lot more attention than she's given.
Occasionally people ask me what would be a good dissertation topic, like in departments back in Greece. And I said, Marietta Rialdi. Marietta Rialdi. The problem, of course, is what we're dealing with is that a lot of these scripts were actually never fully written out, let alone properly published. Now, in recent years, just about a couple of years ago, the General State Archives in Athens received the collection of manuscripts that had to be submitted, play scripts that had to be submitted for film and theatre to the Press and Information Office, which is a euphemism for censorship office under the junta. And there's a folder and there are notes on every single play. But that has only become available in the last couple of years. It was not available when I wrote my book.
Oh, okay.
And so I feel like, oh my God, what a treasure.
Yeah.
But then you can't postpone a book and wait forever, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of, oh my God, there's no work to be done here because it contains not only the original play script, it also contains the censor's notes and deletions. And then it contains a cover sheet saying, you need to change this, you need to delete that. Sometimes the sensitive says, you need to substitute this word by that. Like you can't use the word pornes, which means whores. You have to say la friesse, light women. But I find it odd that the censors seem to think that they can even make the play better by the suggestions they give. Interesting arrogance, isn't it? Not only do we slash, but we actually have suggestions for improvement. So these documents are hugely interesting. And what is particularly interesting is that I had always heard rumors that the censors would send observers to these theaters to sit in the audience in plain clothes and just kind of watch to see whether all the required deletions were indeed implemented or whether they were still there by way of a screen or a board or a placard or an insinuation or anything, and they sit there, keep notes on, write notes afterwards of whether this play really complies to the license it has been given and really respects the restrictions that have been put on it. And these informers then, spies basically, send their reports back to the Press and Information Office. So there's literally a track record of people spying on the productions. And producers and actors had always told me that this was a practice, but I always thought they were exaggerating a little bit. And then until you see these letters, and the letters say like, no, we had required that these lines be gone. And sure enough, they were gone in the first performance, but they were back again in the follow-up performances. And this is really a violation of the terms. And we think these people should be called on it.
So much work that really needs to be done.
Handling those files and the freshness of all that information, handling those properly is really the stuff of a wonderful Greek dissertation.
Definitely. I mean, it just speaks to the nature of the study of Greek literature, the study of modern Greek history, the study of modern Greek anything really is so poisoned by politics and the past.
Yeah. And so full of stuff that needs to be done.
Yeah.
So many good topics that are urgent. I come from a background in classics, and in classics I've never felt this idea that something is urgent, this idea that if I don't do it, it may never get done. And the sources may even get lost. So with many of my topics, I pursue just that, a sense of urgency. And that is especially true for the book on the adoptions, for instance.
Yes, your fascinating book on the adoptions.
and a research that continues because you kind of scratch the tip of the iceberg. And then because you do it and some publicity around this makes this topic better known, all of a sudden you discover more of the iceberg, right? And people help you discover it. But what Koun was also very keen on is that sense of, and again I want to relate this to him, a real sense of bringing out modern sensibilities in place, whether through Brecht or ancient drama or American psychological drama, a real sense of universal anxieties, sensibilities, a transnational dimension really, that an American play can just as well express our anxieties through its own kind of aesthetic. And the Greek audience should not be insular, should really be exposed to this.
Yeah, this is reminding me a little bit of Aris Alexandrou.
Very much so, yeah.
The way in which he's kind of, left of left, I believe you called him.
Yeah.
He is on the edge, and it seems to use ancient tragedy as a kind of way to tackle politics in a middle sense rather than doing it in any doctrinaire way.
Yeah.
Did they engage with each other at all?
No, I don't know of any engagement there.
Okay.
It may well be, but Koun didn't do a whole lot of socializing, and Koun didn't go to a hall of productions. I found that actually very interesting because theater people usually train at night, rehearse at night. The Ford Foundation American Money sent him on a trip of the US, and then he sees productions. He actually goes to Houston, Texas, where he sees the Allied Theater in action, and they work in a theater in the round. And people have always thought that this theater in the round conception was entirely Koun's. But when I see the exchange and his reflection on watching the Allied Theater, which is a big name in Houston, Texas, and the way they work in the round, I can really see influences. And that too, that kind of, we think of Koun as really Athens-based, but that kind of dimension of Koun keeping a transnational antenna active, that is also a dimension that should be written into a work about Koun.
What's Koun's legacy like now? How is he remembered now in Greece?
Really as the formative character of Greek theater, not only Greek theater and the innovation that the plays generate, but also shaping an audience as well, and basically is planting the seed for future generations of playwrights, musicians, costume designers, critics. We forget the critics. Really leaving all the tools with which people can penetrate the theater world very much fortified after he found them very poor to begin with. So he's literally raised them from a level that was fairly low to a level that is of international standard.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I just hope that somebody can be convinced to write that book about Koun, the definitive book about Koun.
Yeah, maybe someday, maybe someone listening to this podcast will decide to embark on a project. But yeah, with that, thank you very much, Gonda.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
A huge thank you to Gonda for introducing us to the work of this rather audacious talent. If you'd like to find out more about Gonda or any of the topics discussed in this podcast, there are links and a suggested reading list in the description. Thank you to Zofia Guertin for production and editing, to Henry Stead and Brave New Classics for the platform, and to all of you for listening. See you next time, or as always, kaleme.